Good evening, Stevie, and thank you for having me on the program once again. And welcome to everybody listening on the Blog Talk platform or whatever platform you happen to be on. If you're watching this online, if you wouldn't mind, hit that subscribe bar and then the notification bell when it comes up so you can be notified whenever content is added to the channel. Remember to comment on these videos, like these videos, share these videos. And if you really want to help us out, give us a thumbs up on the algorithms. That somehow helps it. I don't understand it all. But anyway, this is the Shout It Out segment of the program where one of us answers a question that is submitted from a listener. And if you have a question, a Bible related question you would like us to answer, you can go through Facebook to the Shout It Out page, which is where I got tonight's question, or you can send it to one of the hosts via email or whatever other means. And we'll be glad to answer the question that you have on a Bible topic or a Bible text. And so for this evening, we're going to go and look at a question that comes to us from the Facebook Shout It Out group. Now, the question that was put to us today for the Shout It Out segment comes from Dennis Sharp. And this was submitted through the Shout It Out group on Facebook. And you can go there if you have a Bible question, or you can send it to us through email or other social media means. And we'll be glad to answer any Bible-related question on any topic, any text. And this was added by Dennis Sharp, and he asked the question, do Christians acknowledge that the Bible says that slaves should obey their masters? And he specifically cites the New Testament. Now, this answer is actually, it may seem long, but it's actually a very brief answer. I've spent about a day and a half really going over material relative to this subject. And I've taught history, and I'm a minored in history. And for various and sundry reasons, I've been putting a lot of thought into this topic about the Bible and slavery and that sort of thing. And it's another discussion for another time, exactly why I've got the interest in it. But to the short, concise answer to his question is a conditional or a qualified yes. It does tell Christians, or the Christians do acknowledge the Bible says slaves should obey their masters. We've got at least 3 places in the New Testament where Paul said just that. Now, there's some preliminary matters that we need to understand and lay out. First of all, this study will not answer all the questions. It might even create some more questions in the minds of our viewers and our listeners. I know it's created more questions in my mind since I've been studying this the last couple of days. Second, just recording something does not constitute an endorsement. Probably one of the best examples I can think of from the Bible is the Old Testament, 2 Samuel, when David and Bathsheba got together. It simply records what David did. It does not endorse it. Doesn't say, hey, that's okay. In fact, we find out about a year later that it was not okay when he is confronted by Nathan the prophet. And we also need to define our terms. What do we mean by chattel? What do we mean by slavery? Well, slavery is easy enough to define. The cultural ontology out of the Logos Bible study, which is what I use in my software for my study and lesson preparation, says it's the forced servitude of a person to another. This can range from a benevolent relationship wherein a slave or servant is bound to his master, but is provided for entirely, to a cruel relationship wherein a slave is simply used and barely provided for. And then the Anchor Yale Bible Dictionary makes this note, that slavery is the institution whereby one person can hold ownership rights over another. In the biblical world, this institution took on forms quite unlike the New World slavery practiced in the West, particularly in the 18th and 19th centuries. Now, keep that in mind. We're going to come back to that. And some generalities about slavery and the Bible. This is from the Gospel Coalition, Gavin Ortlund, who says that as I seek to explain the truth, beauty, and goodness of the Christian faith to skeptics and atheists, one of the most pressing objections to Christianity I receive is the Bible pro-slavery? The question is difficult enough in itself, but it's further complicated by how Christians have responded to it in some cases. The answers given are unsatisfactory and may even aggravate concerns. For example, sometimes Christians glamorize both the Bible and church history, failing to take seriously how biblical passages have been used to support sinful practices. And many times we don't really pay attention to the sin committed by prominent Christians. And in history, when we look at how Scripture has been misused and misapplied. And then from Apologetics Press, Eric Lyons wrote this article in 2018 in their publication called Reason and Revelation. Good publication, great company, kind of a cheap, shameless plug there for Apologetics Press if you want good Bible study materials. But he points out, Eric Lyons pointed out that thousands of years prior to the establishment of the Lord's Church and long before Paul addressed the conduct of Christian slaves in the first century, various forms of slavery were commonplace. In fact, virtually every ancient civilization used slaves. Slavery was prevalent enough in Babylon in the 18th century BC to be mentioned numerous times in the Code of Hammurabi. He was a Babylonian king. We don't read about him in the Bible because he was of a time period before the Bible was recording. And Hammurabi gave us one of the first written legal codes, and he dealt with slavery in that particular code. I haven't read it. I don't know all the ins and outs of what goes into the code. And then Lyons goes on to say that Egyptians enslaved hundreds of thousands of Israelites in the 16th century BC. We see that in Exodus and in Numbers. Historians estimate that by the time Paul wrote his New Testament epistles in the 1st century AD, 5 to 8 million slaves resided within the Roman Empire, including 15 to 25% of the population of Italy. And then from Hendrickson and Kersmacher's exposition of Colossians and Philemon from their commentary, we see that in ancient times, slavery was widespread, especially among the Greeks. It was common practice to reduce captives and often criminals and debtors to the state of bondage. If you couldn't pay your bills, you could wind up enslaved. On the island of Delos, sometimes as many as 10,000 slaves were sold in a single day. Among the Romans, the lot of the slaves seemed to have been more cruel than among the Greeks. The slave was not considered to have any rights. The law afforded him no protection. To be sure, there were recorded instances of masters who were kind to their slaves, but these were the exceptions. It is not surprising that a civilization which looked upon all foreigners as barbarians upon labor as unworthy of a free man and as vulgar. And barbarian, that's the original meaning. It was a name that the Greeks simply gave to anyone who didn't speak Greek. It's, of course, has a different meaning for us today. Now, slavery in the ancient Middle East was different than slavery as we know it in American history. In fact, I would say it's apples and oranges. Because many times slavery in the Old Testament in those days was the spoils of war. And one of the best known biblical examples of that is in 2 Kings chapter 5, where Naaman has a slave girl who's an Israelite. And verse 2 says, the Syrians had gone out on raids and had brought back a captive, a young girl from the land of Israel. She waited on Naaman's wife. So here they are raiding. They find this girl, bring her back, and here, Mrs. Naaman, you've got a servant girl now, is basically how it worked out. And if you notice the artwork here, I've got 2 slides here showing different interpretations. Here is one. She looks like she, I don't know, is maybe 11, 12. And in this one, she looks like she's probably about 6 or 7. We don't know how old she was. But this was one way to do it. The spoils of war. Somebody gets captured and you take them back and you enslave them. We see that with the whole nation. When Assyria or Babylon or whoever came in and conquered the land, they would take a lot of Israelites and back to Babylon or Assyria or wherever they came from. And then there was also indentured servitude. Now, we did have this in American history. And this is when among Israelites, going back to Hendrickson and Kersmacher, among the Israelites, an impoverished person could sell himself in order to pay his debts. But his condition was in reality not that of slavery, but rather that of mild indenture, voluntary apprenticeship. And the way it would work in our history was someone wanted to come over from Europe. They would indenture themselves for a period of time. I think it was usually 7 years. So they were in service to maybe whoever owned the ship they wanted on or some other business or apprentice type situation. And then at the end of the 7 years, they were cut loose. And here is the Levitical teaching guidelines on indentured servitude. If one of your brethren who dwells by you becomes poor and sells himself to you, you shall not compel him to serve as a slave. As a hired servant and a sojourner, he shall be with you, and shall serve you until the year of Jubilee, which was every 50 years. Then he shall depart from you, he and his children with him, and shall return to his own family. He shall return to the possession of his fathers. Now notice verse 40 and 41. And he shall serve you until the year of Jubilee, and then he shall depart from you. You'll give him his freedom. That's more the indentured servitude that we had. And then Exodus 21 says, now these are the judgments which you shall set before them. If he's God talking to Moses, if you buy a Hebrew servant, you shall serve 6 years, or he shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th you shall go free and pay nothing. So slavery as it existed in Bible times was usually the spoils of war and indentured servitude. But what about the New Testament? As we see references to slavery there. Well, in Ephesians chapter 6, Paul says, now he's talking here in this context, bondservants and masters. He just got done talking to husbands, telling them to love their wives, and children to obey their parents. And he says, bondservants, be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling and sincerity of heart, as to Christ. But not as with eye service, as men pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, with good will, doing service as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that whatever good anyone does, he will receive the same from the Lord, whether he is slave or free. And you masters, do the same things to them, giving up threatening, knowing that your own master also is in heaven, and there's no partiality with him. And similarly, in Colossians, Paul says for wives to submit to their own husband. This is very parallel to what Ephesians says. Husbands, love your wives. Remember, critics always get stuck on the wives, submit to your own husbands, but go a little further. Husbands, we are commanded to love our wives. They're not commanded to love us. Children, obey your parents in all things. Fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath, lest they become discouraged. Verse 22, bondservants, obey in all things your masters according to the flesh, not with eye service as men pleasers, but in sincerity of heart, fearing God. Whatever you do, do it heartily as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the reward of the inheritance. For you serve the Lord Christ, but he who does wrong will be repaid for what he has done. There's no partiality. Whatever you do, remember, ultimately you work for the Lord, whether you're enslaved or free. You work for the Lord. You work at Walmart. You ultimately work for the Lord. You work for McDonald's. You work for the federal government. You're in the military. Whatever your job is, it may be Walmart on the paycheck, but ultimately as a Christian, you work for the Lord. And then Paul tells the Corinthians that as God has distributed to each one, as the Lord has called each one, so let him walk. So I ordained in all the churches. Was anyone called while circumcised? Let him not become uncircumcised. I've never figured out how you do that, but another discussion for another time. Was anyone called while uncircumcised? Let him not be circumcised. Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing, but keeping the commandments of God is what matters. Let each one remain as in the same calling in which he was called. Were you called while a slave? Do not be concerned about it. But if you can be made free, rather use it. For he who is called in the Lord while a slave is the Lord's freedman. And likewise, he who called while free is Christ's slave. You were bought at a price. Do not become slaves of men. Brethren, let each one remain with God in the state in which he was called. So if you are a slave, he says, don't be concerned about it. But if you get the opportunity to be free, use it. And so slavery in the New Testament, you can see Peter and Paul insisted that Christian slaves be obedient to their masters. And we've got scriptures, Ephesians 6, Colossians, 1 Timothy, and Peter. 1 Peter, that is. And slaves were told not to seek their freedom just because of their conversion. Don't expect special treatment just because of your conversion. And there are several words. This is another thing you always have to take into account. We speak 21st century American English. In those days, they spoke first century Koine Greek, two completely different languages. This is one of or the most common word in the New Testament for slave, and that is doulos, an adjective signifying bondage. It is a noun in Romans chapter 6, verse 19, and the most common and general word for servant. It is used of natural conditions. It is frequently used in the four Gospels. And it is the perfect example of a doulos being Christ himself. And so far as the effects Christianity had on abolishing slavery, honestly, it's a mixed bag. Ignatius wrote to Polycarp, and Polycarp was a disciple of John, the apostle who wrote the gospel and the other three letters. Polycarp lived well into the 2nd century, and he was cautioned against manumission or emancipating, as the hope of freedom may cause false conversions and detract from slaves seeking after God. So they may, oh, goody, I'll get my freedom if I become a Christian, that sort of thing. But Ignatius said, let them submit themselves the more for the glory of God, that they may obtain from God a better liberty. So he seems okay with slavery. Ignatius didn't seem to have much interest in changing the status quo. But at the same time, Christians specifically were the first organized people in history to oppose slavery, in contrast to the entire ancient world. Official state-sponsored slave systems were present in ancient Greece, the Roman Empire, the Islamic states, the Caliphate, the Islamic Ottoman Empire, which is modern Turkey, and Egypt, Japan, India, and a whole bunch of other countries. You had there where slavery existed, and then in the Muslims, especially in Europe, Christians were some of the first, if not the first, to organize against them. Now, most slavery that existed in America, as we said, was chattel slavery. And chattel is the taking is any tangible personal property that is movable. So examples would be your furniture, livestock, basically anything you can pick up and walk off with. Is the simplest way I can think to define it. So like your house would not be chattel because you can't pick it up and walk off with it. That's real property, not personal. Chattel is a catch-all category for property. This is from Cornell University. A catch-all category for property associated with movable goods. And at common law, which is the English common law that we base our laws on, common law, chattel included all property other than real property. Examples include leases, animals, and money. In modern usage, chattel usually only refers to tangible, movable, personal property. So from the 17th to the 19th centuries, about 12.5 million enslaved Africans were brought from Central and West Africa to the Americas. And the colonial system of slavery was practiced in all 13 British colonies. And it's referred to as chattel slavery, and that's where enslaved people were the personal property of their owners for life, and they were a source of labor and commodity. But now in the early 18th century, the kings of Dahomey, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, were big slave traders who made a fortune from this illicit trade, and they were dealing in slaves to Europeans. And to acquire slaves, they waged bitter wars against their neighbors, resulting in the capture of tens of thousands of prisoners who they constantly sold to European slave merchants. And another prominent slave trader was the king of Wida, now a city in southern Benin, and he was captured apparently during an expedition from the kings of Dahomey. And when we remember that the Dahomey king Giza was a slave trader, while the Egbas of Epa, and I don't know how to pronounce that, but we see at once that the desire for the destruction of Abeokuta was prompted by the necessity of removing any potent obstacle to the economic imperialism of the Dahomey kings. So in effect, Giza was forced to clash with the British interests in these. The British became some of the first, as bad as they were at empire, they became some of the first to eventually outlaw the Atlantic slave trade. Many societies in Africa with kings and hierarchical forms of government traditionally kept slaves, but these were mostly used for domestic purposes. They were an indication of power and wealth and were not used for commercial gain. However, with the appearance of Europeans desperate to buy slaves for use in the Americas, the character of African slave ownership changed. So if biblical teaching had been followed, here's the thing, if biblical teaching had been followed, chattel slavery would never have happened in America. But biblical teaching wasn't, and it came down to the money, I believe, that could be made from being involved in the slave trade. Exodus chapter 21, in verse 12 to 27, is the laws concerning violence. And in verse 16 is particularly relevant to our subject here, our discussion, where Moses says, God says to Moses, he who kidnaps a man and sells him, or if he is found in his hand, shall surely be put to death. That's the New King James Version, which I preach and teach out of. The English Standard Version says, whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him shall be put to death. The NIV says, anyone who kidnaps someone is to be put to death, whether the victim has been sold or is still in the kidnapper's possession. So under the Old Testament, all these slave traders running around and taking slaves to the Americas should have been executed. But we don't live under the Old Testament. We live in the New Testament. But here's where how that fits in. Paul tells Timothy, 1 Timothy 1, verse 8, but we know that the law is good for one who uses it lawfully, knowing this, that the law is not made for a righteous person, but for the lawless and insubordinate, for the ungodly and for sinners, for the unholy and profane, for murderers and for fathers and mothers, and for manslayers, for fornicators, for sodomites, now watch this, for kidnappers, for liars, for perjurers, and if there is any other thing that is contrary to sound doctrine, according to the glorious gospel of the blessed God, which was committed to my trust. Now notice that word kidnappers. In the original language, it was an enslaver. It was a man-stealer. It was someone who stole somebody and put them into slavery. It sounds an awful lot like the chattel slavery that we had in America and in Europe and coming out of Western and Central Africa. 1 Timothy 1, the kidnappers steal and sell other people, like in Exodus. So here's the question. The New Testament makes it clear that the value of all people to God. So with that in mind, why didn't Paul or Peter or other biblical writers tell Christians slavery was a sin and put a stop to it? Well, here's the answer, and it's a scholarly answer. My best scholarly answer that I can give you. We don't know. And that's pretty much it. We don't know why they didn't put a stop to it and encourage Christians to do the same. But here's what we do know. Christian emancipators who wanted enslaved people to be set free, eventually they feared the anger of God over the sin of slavery and began to see slavery as unjust and evil and campaigned to have it abolished. Now, it's true there were Christians campaigning just the opposite. But when you take the text in 1 Timothy and you look at Exodus, the Christians who sought to abolish it and emancipate the slaves were in the right. Christian groups opposed to slavery found various ways to show opposition, such as the Quakers, or the Society of Friends, they're also known as. Because by 1727, British Quakers had expressed their official disapproval of the slave trade. And in June 1783, a petition from the London Yearly Meeting was signed by over 300 Quakers petitioning Parliament to abolish the slave trade. And in the 18th century, the Catholic Church became increasingly critical of slavery. By 1741, Pope Benedict XIV condemned slavery in general. And John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist Church, denounced slavery as the sum of all villainies and detailed its abuse in a pamphlet published in 1774. And over time, more and more Christians began to oppose slavery. Samuel Sewall, who was the first justice of the Massachusetts Superior Court, published the first anti-slavery pamphlet called The Selling of Joseph, and that was 1700. Now, he had also been involved in the Salem witchcraft trials, and he later publicly recanted his participation. And he stated in his pamphlet that it is wrong to be bringing enslaved people to Boston, that slavery was not the work of God. Now, perhaps not surprisingly, his work had little immediate impact on slavery in Massachusetts, but eventually more and more New Englanders embraced the abolitionist cause, so that Vermont became the first state to abolish slavery in 1777. That was barely a year after the Declaration of Independence. Then in 1790, Benjamin Franklin sent a letter to Vice President John Adams enclosing with it a letter from James Pemberton and the petition from the Pennsylvania Society for the Promoting of the Abolition of Slavery. The first U.S. Congress was the intended recipient of all these letters, to which the Pennsylvania Society and the Philadelphia and New York yearly meetings of the Quakers, or the Society of Friends, signed letters promoting the abolition of slavery. The Quakers are really some of the very first ones to get on the anti-slavery bandwagon. So, what conclusions can we draw? Well, slavery was a societal and cultural institution, no denying it. It's recorded in the Bible. It's recorded in pretty much all of human history. The Bible recorded that it happened. Now, why early Christians didn't come out against it, we really can't say for certain. In the Greek of the New Testament, there are 9 different words for slave with different meanings depending on context. God's people were given guidelines for owning slaves. But chattel slavery, as practiced in places like America, was and is a sin. It is not something God ever approved of, and it should never have happened. So that's my lesson for this evening. If anybody out there has any questions about this or any of the other lessons I ever do, you can email me at 2timothy4.2.3@gmail.com, or you can look me up on YouTube, or I'm on Facebook, and you can send your questions, and I'll do my level best to get you a biblical answer back to you. So that's my lesson for this evening. Thanks for having me, Stevie. I hope everybody has a Merry Christmas, a Happy New Year, and we will see you in the new year. Thanks for having me. That's my lesson. I'm done, and I am out.